Work release isn't like an ordinary prison. If you're unfamiliar with how the prison hierarchy works, let me explain. You have maximum security institution, places with barbed wire on the fences and men in cages inside concrete structures, whose days are basically dictated by the guard's will. Then you have minimum security, which is mostly dorms that look like summer camp cabins, bunk beds, belongings stacked neatly in lockers, and inmates who have a schedule to go about their day as they choose, within reason. Then there's community custody, which is more like a halfway house. Inmates living in community custody have jobs outside the facility. They earn their own money, and they get to wear regular clothes most of the time. They have one foot in the real world and usually cause very little trouble. This post is deemed too dull for most officers, but after 3 years of running and gunning at Stragview, I was ready for something a little more boring. The major that runs the Midnight Ridge work camp is a friend of mine, you see. He heard I was looking for a change and decided to make me part of his team. So I put in my transfer, waited my customary 3 months for the wheels of bureaucracy to turn, and finally got my marching orders. I thought that after 3 years of hassle and bullcrap, I had finally arrived at a sort of early retirement. I had no idea. There are 3 shifts at work release. The first shift handles the morning, the busiest time of the day, and organizes the vans and the carpools that take our inmates to work. They monitor their GPS tracking and generally field phone calls and questions from the brass or family members. Second shift was responsible for the logistics of bringing everyone home, coordinating arrivals, making sure that by the time third shift arrived at 11, everyone was snug in bed and dreaming about tomorrow's workday. That's where my shift comes in. Third shift was by far the easiest of the 3 shifts. You sat behind a desk for 8 hours and watched the GPS points run for the day on a big monitor. You monitor phone records, call in counts to the control room, and try not to fall asleep. Other than that, not much happens. Third shift is also the only shift with just 1 person on it. That's because you don't have to deal with anyone until the sun rises, unless there's an emergency. I had ridden the 11 to 7 for about 3 months, and I had to say, it was the best post I'd ever had. I had to run chow at 4 a.m. and send 3 groups of loggers out at 5:30, but other than that, I rarely ever even saw an inmate unless I wanted to. That's probably how I lost my focus. I was out on a compound check when I first noticed the sound. Every night at midnight, I have to walk the compound and make sure that everything is locked up. Aside from the 2 dorms, there's a tool shop, a laundry room, a chemical shed, a motor pool, and a lawn shed where we keep the lawnmowers and weed eaters. It's also important to walk around to make sure the grounds are free of garbage and that no one's tried to drop off any care packages during the day. I've been told that sometimes people will do drug drops when all the inmates are at work, so we walk around periodically to check the drainage ditches and look for turned up turf that someone's hidden something under. So, I was walking the ground with my headphones in, listening to Spotify as I made my way around. That's when a harsh noise cut into the music. It sounded like TV static, or the high ree of power lines. I took my headphones off and cleaned the jack, thinking that that was the culprit. Once I had them off, though, I realized that they weren't the culprit. The sound was coming from the yard. Figuring that it was an extra energetic cicada, I kept making my way around as I tried to find the source. By the time I had checked the last shed, the noise had stopped. I walked back in and set about the difficult task of finding something to watch on YouTube in between my hourly rounds. An hour later, I was sitting with my feet on the desk and listening to a creepy reading when something caught my eye on the security monitors. Most of the compound is wired with cameras. You've got 1 in the control room, 1 in the kitchen, 1 in each dorm, 1 in each of the sheds, and 4 that sit in various locations around the outside. 1 of them faces the only road in, another one sits on the parking lot, and the other 2 face the rec yard and the backwoods. I looked at the cameras again, sure I had seen something blip across the back cameras, and nearly flipped out of my chair as I caught sight of something on the rec yard. Someone, I guess, would describe it better. They were standing in the rec yard, right in the middle of the basketball court, and looking at the woods. The center had once been a lumber camp, and it's pretty far back in the woods. There's only 1 access road, and I hadn't seen anyone drive up it. We don't get a lot of foot traffic out here, being about 5 miles from the nearest road, but we do get visitors from time to time. The signs on the road are usually enough to deter anyone that wants to come this far, so the idea that someone had just walked out of the woods and onto my rec yard this late at night was a little hard to believe. I unlocked the cage where we kept the shotguns and headed out nonetheless. It wasn't an inmate, they were all locked down for the night, so it had to be someone from outside the camp. I came out of a side door, barrel leading, and peeked around the edge to get an idea of what I was dealing with. They were still there all right, staring at the woods as they stood out on the blacktop. They were tall, around 6 feet, with a hood that obscured their face. The spotlight on the court showed me jeans and sneakers, and I began to think it might be a man. As I took in his profile and sized him up, I started to hear that high-pitched buzzing noise again. It followed me as I crept closer to the tool shed, and I had to squint as it seemed to buzz against my fillings. It was worse than before, the sound sliding across my mind like an ice skate, and as I swung around to challenge the man, I could feel my left eye twitching from the noise. I leveled the barrel at him as I challenged him in my loudest voice, the words stilted as that loud "ree" raked across me. "This is state property. You are not authorized to be here. State your business before I point my shotgun at an empty basketball court." I swept the barrel around, trying to listen for footfalls or heavy breathing. The guy had been there 1 minute and been gone the next, so if he were still here, I should be able to hear him. There was nowhere he could have made it in the couple of seconds it had taken me to come around the shed, and I was certain he had to be here somewhere. I'd seen him. The camera had seen him, and as I started walking around the shed, I tried to flush him out, challenging him every few minutes as I did so. It took a minute for me to realize that I could have heard him at all, because the loud ringing had disappeared from my ears. 30 minutes later, I had to accept that he had gotten away. The cameras, though. I made my way back to the control room, opening the door with my key, and sat down in front of the camera bank. I should have called Stragview, which is only about a mile up the road, but I wanted something more concrete than my word on it. The fact that he had disappeared had shaken me, and I needed someone else to have seen him. I rolled back the footage by an hour, panning forward slowly as I checked for figures. Maybe the cameras would show me where he'd gone to. I could go back out and find him, cover him until backup got there, and have a little excitement for a change. When I got to the point where I had noticed him on the camera, though, the blacktop was empty. I kept watching, thinking maybe I'd been wrong about the time, but when I rounded the corner with my shotgun a few minutes later, I rewound and looked again. There was no one there. The court was empty, until I got there at least. But I know I'd seen someone on camera. Hell, I'd seen him there when I rounded the shed. How could he have just gone? There was no more YouTube for me that night. I bird-dogged those cameras, my eyes sliding from screen to screen, trying to catch anything that might vindicate what I'd seen earlier. I knew what I'd seen. I'd seen a person out there, but there was nothing there now. The longer I went, though, the more I second-guessed myself. Maybe it had been a shadow. Perhaps I'd been seeing things. Maybe I just wanted there to be something out there. I was looking at the yard when something blipped near the woods. I was used to seeing raccoons and possums as they went about their business, maybe even an owl or a hawk. But whatever this was, it had been big. I panned around to the other cameras and thought I saw a similar large shape loping near the woods. It was too big to be a dog, maybe a mastiff, but I suppose it could be a large cat or something. We did get bear and cougar sightings every now and again, but this was too weird, especially on top of my prowler. When the courtesy phone rang, I nearly jumped out of my skin. The guy on the other end sounded as scared as I was. "Officer, it's Tabish in A-dorm. We got a problem out here." The courtesy phone was how the inmates contacted me after the doors were locked. If one of them had a medical emergency or a fight broke out, that was how they got in touch with me. I had only heard it ring a few times, and mostly it was because I was late opening the doors for chow. Today, however, the guy on the other end sounded pretty scared. As scared as I felt, in fact. "What's going on?" I asked. "Well, something big ran past the window, like a cougar or something. Now there's something loud on the roof. Sounds like it's trying to get in." "The roof? What's on the roof?" "I don't know, sir. It sounds pretty big, and it's..." But suddenly there was a loud ripping sound from overhead, and I heard Tabish scream as it was overtopped by the ringing I had heard earlier. I slammed the phone into the cradle and picked up my shotgun as I turned towards the dorm. It took me 2 steps, though, for logic to rear its ugly head, and I realized that charging off without letting someone know was going to be a great way for me to end up dead. I picked up the phone again, dialing the number for the control room of Stragview, and praying that they hadn't had some kind of problem as well. Someone picked up on the second ring. "Stragview Reception Center, Control Room Officer Cleese speaking." I gave Cleese a short rundown on what was happening, and he assured me that he would send some officers out to help me. "Just don't leave the control room. Lock the doors and stay put until we get there. ETA is about 15 minutes, but it could be a half an hour. We're majorly understaffed tonight." "Do I need to call the police as well? Maybe the..." "No! Cleese came back quickly and decisively. "We will handle this. Stay put and don't do anything stupid." Then he hung up on me, and I could swear I heard that weird static creeping in again through the line. I went around and made sure the doors were locked and tried to keep myself from moving towards the back. I was very curious about what was going on in the dorm, and I found myself walking towards the kitchens before I could think about it. I should, after all, go and make sure the kitchens were secured. It backed up onto the rec yard, and the dorms were beyond that, so if the doors weren't locked, something might get in, right? I had just slid the key into the lock that separated the offices from the kitchen when I heard the frantic pounding of fists. I threw the door open and saw a handful of scared inmates at the back door to the kitchen. They were pounding on the glass hard enough to send cracks running through it, and some of them were looking behind with terrified, jerky glances. Some of them stepped back when they saw the shotgun, but started pounding with more fervor when they saw I was the one holding it. "Please, let us in. These things out here are going to kill us." I glanced out back over the top of the drop sink and saw an abattoir spreading across the blacktop. The overhead lights near the woods and over the blacktop had burst, casting the whole space in a moonlight shadow. I could see large, loping creatures chasing scared inmates in the semi-darkness before burying them and savaging them with huge jaws. Their screams were a cacophony that I was surprised I was only now hearing, and many of them lay dead and bleeding across the blacktop. In the middle of it all stood a hooded man. He stood there amidst the chaos, taking it all in mildly from beneath his black hood. The beasts moved around him, long chitinous bodies moving gracefully, and I almost sensed his approval of it all. Had he brought them here? Were these his pets? My mind tried to make sense of it all, even as that skeletal reeing drove an ice pick into my brain. He turned then, his eyes meeting mine through the window, and I heard the screams dim a little as though someone had turned down a radio. His eyes bore into mine, and I could feel him root around in my brain like fingers over my scalp. The inmates at the door kept shrieking, but I hardly noticed when something came along and dragged them away. Many of the things seemed to be dragging my inmates towards the woods, but the man in the hood commanded my full attention. When he spoke in my head, it didn't even seem that odd. "We don't want you, watchman. Sleep and live to tell your friends what you've seen here. Oh, and be sure to give the warden a special message from me. Be sure to tell him that Reese sends his regards." Then that loud ringing reached a fever pitch, and I felt warmth trickling down the side of my head. My knees cut loose, and I split the left knee of my uniform pants as I crashed to the kitchen floor. I was suddenly assaulted by the loudest ringing I had ever heard, and it felt like a bolt of lightning was rocketing around in my skull. Fortunately, I didn't have long to suffer. I blacked out just as my hands came up to try to cover my bleeding ears. I wasn't aware of anything else until someone slapped me across the face, and I realized I was on the ground. They brought me to the prison and tossed me in a holding cell. That's where I'm awaiting the warden while he compiles the report from the work camp. From what I was told by the yard sergeant, a blunt man who came to interrogate me like a freaking inmate, all the inmates at the center are gone. I told him about the things, about the men, the bodies, and the blood out on the rec yard, but he didn't believe me. The sergeant said they hadn't found any bodies or blood there. The only person they found was me, asleep on the floor after making a disturbing call to the prison about someone attacking the work camp. The doors to the dorms were open, the locks missing, and they expect that there is now a roving band of inmates in the Stragview woods. The only person that seemed to believe me was the warden. He met me at the gate, asking me what had happened and what I had seen. I told him everything. I told him about the big creatures, like hunting cats, that had broken into the dorm, and the blip on the camera I'd seen as they moved around. I told him about the phone call from the inmate Tabish, where he had told me about the creatures that were trying to get into the dorm, and the static bursts as they made their way inside somehow. I told him about the man in the hood, even giving him the message that he had left for him. That was when the warden's carefully constructed cool had evaporated. "Hold him until I get back. I will have more questions for him." So here I sit to await my fate, thinking about the man who came to threaten the prison, and about the work release job I will likely never see again. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story, why not go ahead and subscribe if you're not already subscribed? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky stuff we do here. If you'd like to get a copy of my latest book, there's a link below. Or if you'd like to support the show more monetarily, you can always come down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find something that interests you. If you're interested in my books, I always recommend my Ghostly Reader tier. Ghostly Readers get a copy of my book signed on their doorstep anytime I write one, which is at least twice a year. Patrons always get their spooky a little bit early so they can enjoy them before that night's premiere. And speaking of patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Janet and Winters for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, and thanks to Xaronana, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, Marianne Schuler, Jennifer Damron, and Tyler Parker for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks guys, we just couldn't do the show without you. I'm sure by now you can see some videos appearing at the end here. If you think you might like a little more spooky, why not go ahead and click on another one? I'm sure you can handle a little bit more. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.